Welcome to the Plant-Free MD podcast with Dr. Anthony Chaffee, where we discuss diet and nutrition and how this affects health and chronic disease, and show you how you can use this to optimize your health and happiness, both mentally and physically. Hey guys, just want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Carnivore Bar. I don't promote many products because honestly, all you need to be healthy is to just eat meat. For those times that you're out hiking, road tripping, or stuck at work and you want a nutritious snack that is just meat, fat, and salt if you want it, the Carnivore Bar is a great option. So I like this product not because it's just pure meat, but also because I want the carnivore market to thrive as well. And the more we support meat-only products, the more meat-only products there will be available in the mainstream. So if this sounds like something you'd like to get behind, check it out using my discount code Anthony to get 10% off, which also applies to subscriptions, giving you 25% off total. All right. Thanks, guys. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Anthony Chaffee. I'm here with a very special guest, Dr. Bill Schindler, who is author of the book, Eat Like a Human. Got it here. And met him down in KetoCon this year and really enjoyed that and really enjoyed his talks. He is an archaeologist and professor of archaeology and has just been all over the world, studying what it is to be human and where we got there and how. Dr. Schindler, thank you so much for joining us.
Man, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm so thankful we're doing this. You say that we met at KetoCon. I looked at the program and saw the title of your talk and what your background was, and yours was the first talk. In fact, because we had a booth, yours was one of the only ones I was able to actually get to the full thing.
Oh, good.
And it was great to hear. You're doing some really cool work.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. So for people that aren't familiar with you, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background and what you do?
Sure. So I'm not a medical doctor. My doctorate, my PhD is in archaeology and anthropology. And I come at all of this through that lens. I've been interested in food and diet and health actually my entire life, most of it from the beginning because I had an incredibly unhealthy relationship with food. And I was suffering from all sorts of different metabolic disease because of the way that I ate. And always trying to solve that. I always had an eye towards that, but just in general, because archaeology is so focused on things, right? As an archaeologist, we dig up the remains of activities, or remains of things that our ancestors made and try to make sense of them. When I realized years ago that almost every single prehistoric technology ever made has something to do with food, and by default, food, diet, health, and all of that, and our diet. Changing diets over millions of years impacted our evolutionary change. I realized there was really something important there, and maybe all the questions I've been asking my entire life, asking of doctors and nutritionists, and trying to get information from magazines and the FDA and everywhere else that we try to get that health information from. Maybe the answers weren't to be found there. Maybe they were to be found in the archaeological record. So I dove really deep for a long time, using my work in archaeology to better understand ancestral diets. And then more recently, over the past 7 or 8 years, you can imagine how incredibly difficult it is to piece together all of what you're looking for from this incomplete archaeological record. I started to plug gaps when I realized the value of studying and living and working with indigenous and traditional groups that are still in many ways, using some ancestral and traditional approaches to food. So my family and I have spent a lot of time. We've been very fortunate to be able to travel and live and work with these indigenous and traditional groups to sort of plug those holes in where we have in the archaeological record. So you could say at some level, I've looked to the past my entire life, but more recently over the past 20 years, been putting that together into practice and trying to use our ancestral dietary past to understand how we as humans should be feeding ourselves today.
Very good. And what are some of those different peoples around the world that are still living around and living sort of in a more traditional way that you guys were able to spend time with?
So there's a bunch, and what's really cool is that that Dr. Weston Price has had a strong influence on me since I first read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And at some level, we weren't trying to retrace his footsteps, but do a very similar thing that he did and document, which super cool. These groups from different parts of the world and their resource bases were different from one another, both in what the raw materials were that they had access to, but also how they got them. We spent time with in Tanzania with the Hadza, the oldest hunter-gatherer group in the world. And at the same time, we spent time in Kenya with the Samburu warriors who realized, they have cattle, they raise cattle, they're semi-nomadic pastoralists, and they drink blooded milk. And so different resource bases, different technologies and ways of getting those resources and making them as safe and nourishing as possible for their own bodies. But what we were able to find, same sort of thing that Weston Price found, is that even though the actual things might be different, the same, they're still trying to fill the same nutritional voids, or they're still trying to nourish themselves with the same kinds of foods. And there's a lot of similarities, whether they're hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza or pastoralists like the Samburu. There's a lot of time in Mongolia with groups out on the steppe where one of the main parts of their diet was fermented dairy. We spent time in Bolivia with Aymara groups, and in Peru with Quechua. All over, and I'd love to talk about a bunch of. But the other thing that's really interesting is that I do have in my mind this romantic view of going and traveling really far to get somewhere to spend time with a group that's as isolated as possible to get this information, and there's so much incredible value from that, and we've done that. But we've also spent time in Germany and in Ireland and in England and in places where there's still, there's modern people living modern lives, but still adhering to certain traditions that are really, really powerful, that we can get incredible information from them as well.
Very cool. And Mongolia must have been badass. Like, what do you guys do over there? I think I saw one thing that you said you were in Mongolia and you had like a fermented milk, like alcohol. Like, how was that?
Yeah.
That was
So, Mongolia is one of my favorite places in the world. And what I loved about, as an archaeologist, I love watching hands and the skill of people they can the skill and the knowledge and the know-how, but they can take a raw material and transform it in a matter of minutes or seconds or hours into something completely different. I remember we had to get on this horse. And there's a lot of bareback riding, incredible horsemanship in Mongolia. And I am not a great horse rider, but there was this horse, and we're supposed to get on this horse and ride this horse. And literally, we're in the middle of nowhere on the steppe. I mean, we had been, I bet you it was 12-hour drive, not even on roads to get to the nearest town. I mean, we were in the middle of nowhere, and we were with this. They had some cattle and some camels. And it was just a man and a woman, a married couple. And I got on this horse, and they said, where was the stuff I held on to? Like, where you're riding bareback? I said, I get that part, but my hands, what do I hold on to? And the man, this is through translators, but the man and the woman looked at each other, and the guy disappears, and he comes back with this huge sack full of camel hair. I mean, it was just this huge sack. He could barely carry it. It was so heavy. And him and his wife stood on either side of this sack, and she's pulling this camel hair out of this sack, and he's twisting and he's making this cordage, and he's doing it in ways that I haven't seen. And I mean, in a matter of minutes, they had a full bridle with, I didn't even know the terminology, and it was perfect size. They put it right in front of the horse, and I'm sitting there, and I jump on this horse, and I was unbelievable. But anyhow, what they can do with nothing, and make it useful and nourishing is incredible. So dairy is a huge part, and I'm glad we're starting with Mongolia, because I love some of the takeaways from this. I do believe that the human digestive tract is incredibly inefficient and weak, and we started to outgrow it about 3.5 million years ago, and we started making our first technologies that allowed us to process food outside of our body before we started consuming it. So here we are, living in bodies that have brain nutritional needs because of the size of our brain, because of the size of our bodies, that we can't meet using just our teeth and our fingers and our digestive tract. So we must, in most cases, use technology to take the raw material and make it as safe and nourishing as possible. The one exception to that, in my mind at least, the one food that humans are perfectly designed to consume is dairy. And that's only for a short period of our life, right? When we're first born, we're mammals, we're infants, we're designed to do this. But just like other mammals, when we get weaned off of our mothers, we start to suppress or lose the ability to safely and efficiently consume dairy. Now, for many people, they'll sit there and say, well, that just shows that we shouldn't be drinking milk as adults from other animals. But that isn't how I see it. if that's the viewpoint, then we should eat almost everything. If we took away all the technologies, right, to do anything, you take away the plows, you take away the ovens, you take away the Vitamixes and the fermentation rooms and all these other sorts of things, the spears and the bows and the guns and all of those things, then we really don't have access to much food at all. We require these technologies. So to me, the question isn't, when it comes to dairy, should we consume dairy? I mean, that's a good question. We should have that conversation. But a more important question, and one that we can really have a real conversation about, is how can we most safely and efficiently consume dairy? And one thing that I think we should do to answer that question, this is where Mongolia is the perfect poster child for it, is look at ourselves and how we as infants, when we were perfectly designed to take this raw material and make the best use of it, what did we do? And this is what we do. As infants, when we take milk, so bear with me for a second, because the Mongolia thing comes back. It's because it is the perfect example. When we're infants, we drink from our mothers. The milk that comes from our mothers is body temperature, teeming with live bacteria, already in the process of fermentation. And the bacteria that are there are through it. Evolution for a long time, through evolution, that is figured out that that bacteria operates best at body temperature. It just works perfect. So it's in the process of fermenting. It goes into our bodies, and we, as infant mammals, just like other infant mammals, produce enzymes to break down the fats or the lipase, to deal with the sugar. So we produce lactase. All mammals produce some type of an enzyme that does something to the proteins that allows it to coagulate. In most cases, it's chymosin. In humans, it's something a little bit different, but it does the same thing, and it coagulates the milk and slows it down, so we have time to process, physically and chemically break it down, so we can get all the nutrients from it. And when all of these things are happening, then that milk is one of the most nourishing foods on the planet for our bodies. When we become weaned off of our mothers, we, like other animals, start to lose the ability to produce those enzymes. So it is not. I grew up without any issues with lactose in my family, but there was like one kid in school that was lactose intolerant. And we all thought, that's the weird kid. Like, that's the weird kid that's lactose intolerant. I had that image in my head. I knew like 4 people in the world that were lactose intolerant, because my world was so small that, to me, lactose intolerance is weird. And I think many of us, especially in certain parts of the world, have that same image. So it's weird to have a human that's lactose intolerant. But the reality is, it's weird that some of us are lactose tolerant. Like, it's the norm for us and other mammals to lose the ability to produce that enzyme lactase that breaks down the sugars lactose. And for humans, there were several different independent genetic mutations, some in Europe and some in Africa, where there was a huge dependence on milk, where there was an independent, completely different genetic mutations that allowed our bodies to produce lactase into adulthood. 60% of adult humans are lactose intolerant still. So the cool thing about fermentation is that when you ferment the dairy, right, the dairy is full of bacteria and it's fermenting. It's lactobacillus bacteria that eat the lactose and produce lactic acid and a bunch of other important chemical and physical changes. And as it consumes that lactose level goes down. So when you have yogurt that's fermented for 24 hours, there's no lactose in it. When you have a cheese that's been through a traditional cheese through the full fermentation process, and it's aged, that cheese either has very little or zero lactose in it. Any fermented dairy product, kefir, for example, has a lot less, almost zero lactose compared to what it was when it was milk before it was fermented. So here we are in Mongolia, where you have an incredibly strong dependence on dairy. I mean, it is the mainstay out on the steppe, such a staple part of everyone's diet. And you would expect that they have a high degree of lactose tolerance, that they would have gone through, somebody would have had this genetic mutation that seemed like it worked, natural selection would work perfectly, and all of a sudden, almost everybody's lactose tolerant as adults, but it's almost the exact opposite. Almost everybody in Mongolia traditionally are lactose intolerant, but they have this huge dependence on milk. And the difference is nobody drinks milk. You don't see anybody taking a cup of milk and drinking it, or taking the milk and pouring it on cereal in the morning, like the way most Americans consume milk. The dairy is always fermented. It's always fermented. They make yak butter. It is fermented yak butter that they ferment and age in yak stomachs. They make all sorts of these fermented dairy things that they then dry on top of the ger or the yurts. And they even make, as you mentioned, this alcohol, this beer, with fermented mare's milk. Mare's milk has a high amount of sugar in it. and it ferments very well and produces alcohol. Now it's not a really high, it's like, I don't know, 2.5% or something like this, but they ferment it. It's very interesting. It's actually got a really cool flavor, and they also distill it into a milk vodka, which I smuggled I smuggled some home in a water bottle, and it looks, my son, who I obviously everybody had to try it, no matter how old they were. Everybody had to try it. So our kids were super young, and my son at the time was 10, and he had to say, he put it to his nose and he smelled it. He looked at it, tasted it, and he said it smelled and tasted like liquid blue cheese, which it did. But it was it was super interesting. But anyhow, I know it was a little bit of a tangent, but I think it had an important one with the lactose intolerance.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, I think that just, I mean, obviously seeing how people like, live traditionally now is a good, mirror, because they've been doing this stuff for thousands of years. A lot of these people, and you go up to, I don't know if you want to, with Inuits and things like that, but they've basically been doing that, since the ice ages, essentially, I would imagine, and so I think it's very interesting. And the alcohol too, that's something that people always ask me, is like, do you drink alcohol? I'm like, no, not really. It's a plant. I'm like, well, what if they made like, like meat-based, alcohol? I'm like, yeah, probably not. It's still a poison. But some yak vodka, maybe, I think I'd try it anyway.
You have to try it. You have to.
Yeah. And I think if you're in that area, when you're like, you're out, like you say, just like hundreds of miles away from anywhere. And, you have that, I mean, when in Rome, and when in yurt, you should just, do as they do,
and you said such a good point. The context is so important. Like it's one thing for us to sit here, and I mean, we're how many miles away from one another? We're 12 hours apart at the moment. We're sitting here talking about, mare's milk, fermented mare's milk in Mongolia, and it's a great conversation. But being there and trying it and having it is such a completely different thing. And you do. If anybody gets the chance, you have to try it. Yeah,
that would be awesome. You also talked about, I remember seeing something you were saying, like, you were interested in food, you were interested in hunting, you're also interested in tools. You had a great showcase showing how, like, people actually made tools and things like that. And I saw one thing where you were saying that you wanted to be able to make all the tools and go hunting and, like, like make the bow and arrow, make the arrowheads, fletch the arrows yourself, like, shoot the deer and then cook it in a fire that you made. And that has to be one of the most raw, badass things that I've ever heard. I mean, it's like what it is to be a man, it's just like, you go, you get food, you make fire, and like, that's it, like, how was that? Did you end up actually doing that and being able to do the whole process?
Absolutely. And we've done it in a couple of different contexts. And that was, I'm so glad you brought that up. Man, I forgot I even talked about that. Yeah. That was the reason I became an archaeologist. So my father always had me outside hunting and fishing and trapping and hiking and camping and doing all those sorts of things. And he really instilled in me this love for the past. At that time, with what we knew about the world, I mean, there was Indians and there was, fur trappers in the 1800s and things. And we used to read all these biographies and look for arrowheads and that, but we had no idea about the depth of our human ancestral lineage and how deep it really went and what it all meant. But he instilled all of that in me. And I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and I loved hunting and the connection that my father and I made with one another, and we made with the environment, and we made with nature, and with the food that we got. All of that connection was awesome. And I was always looking for a little bit more. And I wanted that. It was cool. It was really awesome for me to go out and get up early and go into sit in the woods, and the woods would come alive over several hours, and the sun came up, and listen to the animals, and be able to harvest the deer and take care of it ourselves and bring it home and eat it. But the gun in my hand felt a little different than what I wanted. I wanted to shoot. I wanted to use a bow. So I started bow hunting, but it still was somebody else. Like, a whole bunch of people I never met were between me and that food because they made that bow. And again, this isn't just going out and hunting at all. It's such an incredibly visceral, connective experience. But I was always looking for just a little bit more. So I said, I'm going to learn to make bows and arrows, and I'm going to make a bow, and I'm going to kill a deer. So I started to learn how to make, but there wasn't the internet, right? You had a couple of books, and there were some people I heard about that did these things. So I went and worked with some people and read everything I could. And I finally made a bow, and and I was trying to do the arrows and all this, which was great. But it was the arrowheads that were the stopping point. Like I didn't really realize that there were people that still knew how to make arrowheads. And turns out there's a huge community around the world of flint knappers and stone tool, people that I've since been in, deep contact with and become a part of that community. But then I had no idea. In like 1990, I had no idea that there were other people doing these things. So I started to play around with it a little bit, read what I could. But at the time I was living in New Jersey, and if I was going to go to all this work, I didn't want to look at a book on how Californian Indians made stone points. I wanted to use the rock from, I was going down a rabbit hole, I realized, but I wanted a rock from New Jersey. I wanted the same shape. I wanted it made the same way. And I wanted to, try to recreate all these things. And I couldn't find the answers to those questions. So I said, these answers are in archaeology. Like, let me figure out how, let me become an archaeologist. And I wanted to become an archaeologist so I could deer hunt, really. That was what it was. So I did. And it's been an amazing journey, because I finally did answer those questions. But more importantly, I found out that there were questions I didn't even know I should be asking. What I was looking for was essentially what I said in the beginning. How do we create these technologies to actually get this food and do something to this food? But I didn't realize it was so across the board. It is. It was, you say badass, which I love that term, but it was so connective and rewarding. Now, I will be honest, my son and I, we still bow hunt. And actually we're going on a huge hunt in December. And we're actually just started making new bows for it. But we also gun hunt. So we love that connective piece that comes with it, but we also are very interested in making sure that our freezer's full for the winter. So we do a little bit of both, but it's really, really cool.
Oh, very cool. And then you were on a show, The Great Human Race, and I haven't had a chance to watch that yet. I'm still trying to I think it's on, you said it was on Amazon, I think.
It's on Amazon. It's a couple places, but Amazon Prime has it for sure.
There you go. Yeah. And so I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but I've seen some promos for it, and that sounded cool as hell. Where can you tell us a bit about that, where they sort of put you out in different period sort of instances, and you should have to sort of live like the people did at the time.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So this was now what 6 years ago. It was 6 years ago. The survival TV world was really hitting its peak. There've been a bunch of shows for a while, and then a bunch of things like Dual Survivor and Dude, You're Screwed, and a bunch of other things. And it was actually starting to get really silly because they were running out of ideas. There was Naked and Afraid, which I think is maybe even still going on. There was a bunch of these shows, and everybody was scrambling for the next new thing. And it was, like I said, it was getting silly. They were tying, they take two people and tie them together and make them go survive, and they do all sorts of things. But National Geographic got together. Now there's National Geographic Studios and National Geographic, the Society, right? Studios does the TV stuff, and the Society does like the magazine and the research and that sort of thing. Most of the programming for National Geographic just comes from the studios. But for this particular project, they both got together and they came up with a brilliant idea. And they said, listen, let's take it, instead of just trying to make something crazy and new and novel so we get viewership and jump on this survival TV bandwagon, let's use this sort of wave that's still about to hit its crest and use it to tell an incredibly important story of our shared ancestral human past. And they did. They didn't know exactly what they were going to do, but they knew they could do something and do it really cool. And they contacted me to be a part of it. They had already had my co-star Kat Bigney, who's a survivalist. She does a lot of high desert survival out west. And they brought me in as the partner. We're going to be a team. And my job was to recreate the technologies from different time periods in the past, right? The tools, which is one of my specialties. And what they were going to do is they were going to take us. And what they did was there's 10 episodes over this series. And it starts at 2.5 million years ago. At that time, and this is only 6 years ago, we thought that the earliest stone tools in the world dated to about 2.5, 2.6 million years ago, these old one technologies. Since then, we found out that there's tools that date 1 million years older. But anyhow, at the time, that's what we knew. So 6 years ago. So we're going to start there. And the idea was over 10 episodes, starting at the earliest, 2.5 million years ago, we were going to be on location where something important was invented or discovered or figured out that allowed our ancestors to take another step or do something a little different. And they were going to put us in that location. We were supposed to live for a period of about 10 days using only those technologies to feed ourselves, to house ourselves, protect ourselves, all those things. And then we'd go to the next spot over and over again. We'd end up at 4,000 years ago in Oregon. So we went through Africa, we went through the Middle East, we went through Asia, and ended up in Oregon at 4,000 years ago. And it was mind blowing. Again, there were certainly it's television. They weren't going to let us die right out there. But what I love about it is several things. One is I've been a professor for 20 years, college professor, and I hate standing in front of a room. And even if I'm knowledgeable about it, I hate speaking about something I haven't experienced or done. But here I am as an archaeologist trying to talk about what life was like 500,000 years ago. How do you do that? Well, we had a chance to do it. Like we literally, even though it was 10 days at a time, 10 days is long enough to feel scared. 10 days is long enough to feel hungry. 10 days is long enough for us to feel uncomfortable, but it's also long enough for us to feel nourished and safe and comfortable and all of those sorts of things. And it was mind blowing. So we made the different technologies. We used the different technologies. I spent 500 hours making our clothes for the different episodes. We had an opportunity. We had a team of 10 people fact checking things, and back in New York City, that every time we were going to do something or they were fact checking, making sure that this was something that was accurate. And we had a whole bunch of specialists who were brought in throughout the entire series to help out. We had fixers on the ground all over the world that helped out. Each time we went to a new place to film a new episode, and this is kind of where the jumping off point for a lot of this anthropological work we later did was, as a family, we lived with groups from that area for days, sometimes a week or so, to learn about the wild plants, and which were poisonous, which were good, and where the animals hung out, where to stay away from these snakes, and all of those sorts of things. So that was a huge experience. But also, and I've been spending much of my life making these tools and using these tools in an artificial context, right? We're sitting here, even if I was deer hunting with a homemade bow, like if I didn't get the deer, I could come home and order a pizza if I wanted. I wasn't going to starve. But here we were, where we had to rely on these tools, these stone tools or these bone tools or these pots that we made, or we had to make fire with sticks. And if we didn't make fire with sticks, then we weren't going to have fire on that night. And it was such an educational experience, a major educational experience for me. But I loved the opportunity to, for the first time ever on TV, show many of these technologies. I remember there's a technology, I don't know if I have one here to show you, this Le Valois technology, which is about 250,000 years old. It is uniquely Homo sapien, right? Our species. It was one of the first technologies that we created when we appeared on the planet. Never before shown. It's an incredibly difficult technology to reproduce. And I had the opportunity to actually do it. Actually, I have a funny story about it, but do it on TV. And in a way that, it wasn't this boring, dreadful documentary and everybody's exhausted and just listening to these people talking and you see charts and graphs. I mean, it was an exciting thing. So I remember when it was all over, I'd get all these emails and contacts from these kids. I mean, 10-year-old kids that are talking about Homo erectus and the Schulian hand axes, and they're outside making forts in the backyard and doing all these things. I thought was brilliant. I mean, kids are saying Homo erectus, and it was awesome. So it was a really important part of my life, and a really important part of it really nailed home for me and solidified the fact that this track of looking at our evolutionary past, technologies, dietary change, and all this was really, really important.
I think that leads pretty nicely into the question of like, okay, so what were you guys eating? What were they eating? What tools they have, and what was sort of the progression? What did that do for us as early humans and our progress into today?
That's a really good question. So one couple really quick things I think to preload this part of the conversation. One thing we have to remember is that our ancestors were not surviving. And that was one thing that we had, one of the discussions or the points of contention that we had with everybody doing the show and producing a show and all this, and us out there, was that they kind of, I mean, it's TV. They wanted to see us suffering. I mean, they wanted the ratings. They wanted to see us pissy. They wanted to see us cursing. They wanted to see us wet and miserable and covered in bugs and all these other sorts of things, and starving. And the reality, and I kept saying, that's not the right image to present. That isn't the way that it was. Now, first, listen, don't get me wrong. There were a lot of people that died. I mean, everybody at some point died in over 3.5 million years. And a lot of people died very tragically. A lot of people died because they starved, and a lot of people were sick and because they were malnourished. But those were outliers. You know, I know you heard the story, but let me tell it real quick, because I think it's a really good point. Right before I got contacted for National Geographic, my students wanted me to be on Naked and Afraid. And if anybody has ever seen it, they take two people, a man and a woman, who never met each other supposedly, and they stick them in the middle of nowhere. And the first time they see each other, they're naked, and they have to survive for 28 days. And they have a little necklace that has a microphone, and they kind of self-film most of it. And obviously they put a man and a woman together naked because, you know, for ratings and all this. But the students wanted me to do this, and I didn't want to do it for a couple of reasons. But one of the reasons is I'm a married man with 3 kids, and I didn't want to do it. But I didn't want to tell the students I didn't want to do it because it was embarrassing. So I wanted somebody else to say I couldn't do it, and then I could tell the students to somebody. And I said, "Who's better than this than my wife? She's going to put an end to this." So I brought her up. We were like in a bedroom or something. We were talking, and I said, "Sit down, please. I got a question for you." She says, "Yeah." I said, "You seen that show Naked and Afraid?" And she's like, "Yeah." And I said, "Students want me to be on it." And she's like, and first of all, she started thinking. And right away, the fact that she started thinking then really worried me. Like, well, what are you thinking about, right? So I said, yeah. So about a minute or two later, she said, "I think it'd be okay." And I said, "You think it'd be okay?" So 2 things went through my mind. One is, I have no excuse for the students now. And why does my wife think this is okay? And so I asked her, why is it? And she said, "Listen, you've seen the show. You know as well as I do that even if somebody's going out there with sex on their mind, after a day or 2 of literally starving and getting eaten up by bugs and ticks and covered in poison ivy and sunburn and all the other things and no sleep, all the other parts of it, the last thing on their mind is messing around." She said, I remember she said, that'll probably be the safest place for you. Yes, you can absolutely go. And so that screwed my whole plan up. Yeah. But I thought about it. I'm like, you're absolutely right. Like, you're absolutely right. The story of our evolutionary past is not one of, you know, Australopithecines 3.5 million years ago, 3.5 feet tall, brains the size of my fist, just kind of getting by and making it for 3.5 million years. And if it was that, okay. No, it's a story of, you know, spreading around the world, increasing population size, most importantly, having the nutrition to support massive body and brain growth over time. That isn't a story of our species surviving, right? They're not naked and afraid. That is a story of our species getting so much incredible nutrition into their bodies that they can support all of these things and continuing to do it better and better and better and better. Our ancestors were not surviving. They weren't even subsisting. They were thriving. That was the story I wanted to tell to that show. I don't think it came across so well, but that is the story. That's the picture that we really should have in our minds. So the tools that to get back to your question, the tools that our ancestors created were so incredibly powerful. They weren't, you know, the kinds of, you know, they weren't microchips, they weren't the space shuttle, they weren't those kind of things, but they were just as, if not more powerful in what they allowed our ancestors to do. And it really, if you think about it, it breaks down, and the tools and the technologies they created break down into 2 major categories. One is that they allowed us to overcome our physical limitations and access increasingly diverse and incredible resources from our environment. And then number 2, once we had those resources that we couldn't just get with our nails and our teeth and our muscles or whatever, once we had those resources, then these other technologies allowed us to do something to those resources, whether or not they were, you know, something we were designed to eat. In almost all cases, they weren't. we could convert them and transform them into something that we could derive incredible nutrition from. So things like stone tools, fire, pottery, digging sticks, butchering tools. Those are the kind of things that I'm talking about. Very simple, very, very simple, but powerful. Because, one of the examples I usually give is when we made our first stone tool 3.3 million years ago, in less than a second, our Australopithecine ancestors struck two rocks together and created an edge, a razor sharp edge that was stronger and sharper than any part of our body. And when it did get dull, they could do it again and make it again in less than a second. And that completely transformed our relationship, with our environment. But the other quick takeaway, I think, from those two categories of technology surrounding food, and I think one that your audience would really get a lot of use from, is that almost all up until the agricultural revolution, so everything changes at 10 to 12,000 years ago, but for the entirety of millions of years, almost every technology surrounding, including animals in our diets, had something to do with getting the animal. I mean, our biggest issue with having access to meat or organs or blood or fat or whatever is actually overcoming our physical limitations and getting that animal, right? That's the hard part, right? So we created bows and arrows and atlatls and boomerangs in Australia and the throwing sticks and those sorts of things, boomerangs. Nets and traps and fishing hooks and all of those things that we did to get the animals. But once we have that animal, all we need is a sharp edge and we can cut it open. Sure, we can cook some of it if we want. Meat does seem to have, there's a little bit of a nutritional benefit to just a little bit cooking meat. But otherwise, if you have a dead animal in front of you and a sharp edge, all of that incredible, massive nutrition that's sitting there in that pile is not only safe, but incredibly nutrient dense and incredibly bioavailable. All you got to do is start diving in. So the technologies for millions of years surrounding animals were about getting the animal. Plants, completely different. It's the exact opposite. Almost all the technologies involved with including plants in our diet, other than, again, basically maybe a digging stick to get roots or something sharp to maybe cut something off of a tree, almost all the technologies were about taking that raw material and getting it ready for our bodies, because every single plant on this planet has toxins. And even when they do have nutrition, that nutrition is incredibly difficult for our bodies to have access to. So there's been a lot of energy and time and deliberate technological innovation trying to detoxify plants and make the nutrition in those plants available to our bodies. And I think that's a huge, huge distinction.
Yeah, and that's another question too, because obviously that's something that everyone has a hard time with now, especially when they were pushing vegan and plant-based, being like, oh my goodness, no, we're in the Garden of Eden, we just eat, this is the bounty from God, and this is just all for us. And but this is something that's quite well established in botany and horticulture and all these other things. That's just biologically how plants defend themselves, is by being toxic physically. I mean, they have other defenses as well, but that's a major one. So when did people start, sort of dipping into, the plant kingdom to start eating? And obviously they had to do more work to get that. And I think I was talking to Dr. Mickey Bendor, and he was saying that he looked at this from like a economic point of view, because he had a history in economics before he did his PhD in paleoanthropology. And he said, like, just economically, like, it doesn't make sense. Like, why would you eat plants? You get 10 times the return for your investment, eating animals, And so at what point did that shift where we started eating more plants, or how do we know? Like, what was the evidence for that?
Well, first off, I love Mickey Bendor's work. I absolutely love it. And he's adding a voice to the anthropological community that really needs to be there. One thing I'd like to say before we dive in really deep into this is archaeology is not a hard science, right? It's not like biology or chemistry or physics or anything like that. We have a lot of numbers. We do a lot of measurements. We draw things and have great graphs. But at the end of the day, every level of archaeological interpretation is a hypothesis, right? Even down to what a tool should be called and how it should be used. And there's no way that we can take out the biases in the archaeologists or the anthropologists that are trying to, including myself, obviously, when we look at an you take the same archaeology and put it on a table, and 10 different people could interpret 10 different things. And there's a lot of things can help create those biases, right? And a lot of it has to do with how the archaeologists themselves view the world. A lot of archaeological interpretation, there's a lot of amazing archaeology taking place in the 40s and the 50s for a lot of different reasons, the 60s, 70s, obviously. It's not a very old discipline. Modern archaeology really is about 100, 130 or so years old. And we've learned a lot. We've learned a ton. But a lot of in the mid 20th century, there was a lot of archaeology being done. And imagine, and think about it, like Indiana Jones. I mean, archaeology, Indiana Jones, World War II. Think about what's going on in the world at that time, especially when we're talking about American archaeologists. We have a lot of, everybody had troops all over the world, but America had a lot of troops over, and we were planning these victory gardens. I mean, in the conscience of the country, everybody wanted to do something to help the war effort. What can we do if we can't go fight? What do? We have meatless days, and we have victory gardens. We're going to help our sons win the war because we're planting carrots in our backyard for some reason. But truly, our conscience was really plant focused. Plants were helping us win the war. Plants were helping us do these things. We were helping the war effort when we didn't eat meat in our house. And there were obviously shortages and these sorts of things as well. And there's no doubt that that mindset, that way we viewed the world and what we should be eating and what we should be accomplishing and all these other sorts of things made its way into archaeological interpretation. And a lot of the standard text and a lot of the archaeological what resources that people go to were really written at that time. Some of the most famous archaeologists are from that time period. And plants became a huge focus. Everybody was looking for who was eating plants and how they were eating plants. And, they were figuring things out, like optimal foraging theory based on foraging patterns. And we had Yule Gibbons, one of the first, foragers who was writing about foraging and in books that made it all over the world in the 60s and the 70s. Then we had the 70s where plants were a huge focus. So, for decades, were the basis of a lot of the archaeological interpretation that forms what we're taught in college classrooms still today is from that time period. So plant focused. We were doing everything we could to find out how people were eating plants, and we weren't giving enough credit to hunting. We weren't giving enough credit to animals. So somebody like Miki Bandor's voice now is a strong, incredible voice that's helping to even out that conversation. It's difficult to see plants in the archaeological record for obvious reasons, because they're so incredibly, they can be destroyed so easily through natural processes. We can see them though, especially we can see a lot of plant microfossils, things like phytoliths, which are little silica bodies that form in plants, and their morphology, their shape is different depending on the plant that they're from, and they get stuck in pores of rocks, starch grains, and other sorts of things that we can find on tools that were used to process plants. But we're really only talking about going back 6, 7, 8, 9,000 years with some of these plant microfossils, and able to understand how they were dealing with plants and how they made a difference in the diet. So it's difficult to see plants back 2 million years at the time periods that we're talking about. So let's put that aside for a second. What I do think we really need to understand is that, and listen, I eat primarily animal foods. I'm not full carnivore, but I'm damn close to it. And the plants that I eat, I'm making sure that I either anything that has a high toxin load I can't deal with, I don't eat. And when they, in other cases, I'll either be detoxifying them or processing them properly. But just before I start this next piece, I want everyone to understand I am primarily an animal eater. But I do want us to have the right vision in our head of what that ancestral dietary past was like, and the role that plants played. It wasn't that we were eating animals and then we started incorporating some plants here and there. We were eating plants and bugs and then started eating meat. But so we've always been eating plants. But here's the thing: the plants that we were eating right, by default, and when we're talking about a time period where we had very low nutritional needs, our bodies were small, our brains were small, and we had no technologies whatsoever to assist us in getting food, and then to assist us in processing it before we ate it. So we relied solely on our bodies. So everybody listening, imagine we shrunk you down to 3.5 feet tall, everything shrunk in proportion. The only difference is that your guts would proportionally be a little bit bigger, your teeth would be a little bit bigger proportionally. But other than that, we're, muscles smaller, all these things smaller, and said, go eat. And with just your nails and your teeth and whatever, with no greenhouses and there isn't anything, no grocery stores, there's no shipping from Argentina into another part of the world at a different season. So you were forced by default to eat hyper seasonally and hyper local. All plants have some sort of a toxin. So those that have toxins that were too toxic to consume without processing were not even on your radar. You couldn't touch them. You couldn't eat from those resources. So you were only eating the things that were growing there when they were available for you to eat them, that had a lower toxin load, and it required absolutely no processing at all. It's a very little amount of food. I'm convinced the most nutrient-dense bioavailable components of the diets at that time period were insects. Mm-hmm. Then, that's millions, it's 5 million years ago, 7 million years ago. Then we hit 3.5 million years ago, where we start making tools, allowing our ancestors to butcher scavenged animals. They're introducing meat and a little bit of marrow into their diets, which is fantastic. And then, obviously things change when we start to hunt, and then we can, we become the predators, and we have first access to the entire animal, including the most nutrient dense bioavailable parts of blood, the fat, and the organs. And that's when everything starts to change. So we were eating plants, we were eating fruits, hyper seasonally, hyper locally, the lowest toxin loads possible, which was very, very limited. It wasn't, please don't get this image in your head that, or anybody listening, that when you walk into the produce section of the grocery store, that's what it was like for our early, gatherer ancestors. It was nothing like that at all, because there's no seasons in the grocery store. The cool thing is when you're eating like that, and throughout our prehistory, there's so many just natural limiting mechanisms to stop you from over consuming, especially plants that have toxins that can build up over time. So even if there was a plant that had something like oxalates in it, for example, you only have access to it for a week or two out of the year. Mm-hmm. And you maybe consume, something like some oxalates for 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden you're not eating any for a certain period of time, and your body has time to release. So there's those sorts of things happening. But now nuts, for example, we eat so many nuts today because we can go to the big box grocery store and buy a huge bag of shelled, ready to eat nuts for $10, and you can eat them by the handful. And if I said to you, think, oh my God, I'm eating this amazing keto diet, I'm eating all these nuts, and this is how people ate in the past too, and this is fantastic. It's nothing like how people ate nuts in the past. If I said, here's 2 rocks, go out to that tree, pick up all the nuts, take the holes off the nuts, shell all the nuts, pick all the pieces out of the nuts, and then eat the nuts, you're eating a little bit like this for the entire day. You're not eating handfuls of them. So these limiting mechanisms that prevented our ancestors from getting really sick from some of these foods are no longer limiting mechanisms for us. We don't have seasons in the grocery store anymore. We don't have that localness in the grocery stores anymore. We're touting incredibly dangerous super plants as superfoods and eating massive quantities of them, and then making them super cheap, and then we can eat them 2 or 3 times a day, for 365 days out of the year, and causing all of these sorts of issues. That isn't the way people were eating plants in the past. I am convinced. The other cool thing about animal resources compared to plant resources is that animal resources are available all year round, no matter where you are in the world. Now, certainly animals migrate, right? And it's easier to get different animals at different times, right? But animals in general are always available. There are some changes, right? There are fat stores change, depending on the season and those sorts of things. What's interesting about fat, though, is that visceral fat, the fat that's like, the stuff that we, belly fat sort of thing, that does change throughout the season. So a deer right now, white-tailed deer here in Maryland, right now, well, a couple months ago would be very, very lean. Right now, they're starting to put on fat to get them through the winter. At the end of the winter, they're very lean again. But an animal will die of starvation before it eats its marrow stores. I mean, there's always marrow in the bones. There's always bone grease in the bones, which you can get out through boiling. So this idea of eating very lean animals in the middle of or in the hot areas is not true if you're accessing all those other fats. Animals are available all year round. Plants are only available at certain times of the year when you're eating wild plants. And again, that's different than the way that we consume at the grocery store today.
And they're poisonous. And so that's a good thing.
And they're poisonous. And they're poisonous.
So you talked about how we can look at that residue on like stone tools sort of up a few thousand years ago, or several thousand years ago. Is there that same sort of residue on the stone tools for meat? Can we show that like this tool was used for meat, this wasn't used for something else? We weren't using this bow to hunt lettuce and things like that. Is there anything like that exists as well?
Let me give me 1 second. I'm going to grab something. I'm going to give you a little visual. Hold on 1 second.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have had something over here ahead of time.
That's all good.
This is, and you saw this when we were at KetoCon, but here is an example. This is a resin cast of the first stone tool. And I think it's important to show for a couple of reasons, but I can illustrate a really cool point for you too. So this was one rock. It was struck. This is an exact replica of the 3.3 million year old stone tool. Rock of the right kind of material, so like a flint or a chert or obsidian. This is actually basalt. Struck right here, and then this is the flake that comes off. So this was the original first butchering tool, earliest one we've ever found, at least to date. The reason I wanted to show you this for this conversation is that these rocks are struck, right? They're struck, and pieces come off, and there are, depending on the rock and how it's struck, there's a part that's left behind, and when you take all these flakes off, you create these little fractures in the rock. Sometimes like this, you can see them, but in other cases, they're microscopic. And these little microscopic cracks can collect residue. If you're using that tool to, say, cut a root, a lot of times starches can get stuck in there, and then we can look at the starches and see what kind it is. But blood can also get stuck up in there. And we can use a couple of different tests to tell if blood is there, and then there's also ways to look at that blood and see what kind of blood it was, or at least in general, what family of animals that blood came from. So yes, we cannot, but again, we're talking about these, the ability to do that only goes back thousands of years. It doesn't go back millions of years. However, there are ways to look at the bones themselves will preserve very well. A lot of times the bones themselves can get fossilized. So bones of animals that were butchered can get fossilized, and then we can look at those bones. And there's a lot of different ways to tell whether that animal was butchered, whether it was hunted. So for example, and there's been a lot of studies done. I actually co-authored a paper for the Journal of Archaeological Science, I think, where we were looking at cut marks that were left on bones to tell that those bones were actually butchered. So this by a human or one of our ancestors, and not gnawed on by, say, a hyena, right? So this tool, when you use a tool like this to butcher, or even a knife when you go to butcher, there's certain places where you would expect to find these butchering marks, right? There's certain places that you would attack the muscle on the bone in order to get the muscle or the meat off. So number one, the location of where these marks are helps us understand that they're being butchered, but also the marks themselves under a microscope. We can tell if it was being cut with the stone tool or whether a hyena or some other scavenger was sitting there gnawing on it. So that's number one. Number two, a lot of times we find tools like this in association with the bones of the animals. And then obviously it makes a lot of sense as well. We also find, we've done a lot of experimental work to look at fracture marks on bones. And we can look at a bone and tell when it was struck with another rock intentionally to open it up so people could access the marrow in the bones for nutritional purposes. Same thing with skulls. We can tell when skulls are being bashed on purpose with a rock in order to access the brains. The other thing we can do is, we study modern humans, but we also study modern animals, modern predators, and look at how they hunt, and when they go after a kill, are they going after males? Are they going after females? Are they going after a certain age all the time? And we have all these really nice an understanding of the patterns of predators in general. And when you see accumulations of bones in the archaeological record, you say, okay, that is a natural accumulation made by a natural predator. And then when humans hunt, we don't do things necessarily that are always the most efficient or make the most sense. A lot of times tradition or ritual or other things play a role in how we make decisions. And we hunt in very different ways. Even people around here, there are people that I know that trophy hunt for deer, that will only kill a deer that has a huge rack on it so they can put it in the basement. My son and I, we hunt for meat. So the way that if you looked at all the bones from all the animals that we've harvested, the assemblage of them would be a completely different representation of males and females and ages than somebody who's trophy hunting. So when we look at the assemblages of the bones, we can tell a lot about what, whether it was done by a human or an ancestor or one of our ancestors or a predator, and what they were really targeting, what they were looking for. And what's also fascinating and is that we can tell what people valued out of that animal, right? So think about it. If you went hunting, you killed a deer, and all you wanted was the back straps. You love the back straps, and all you wanted was the back straps. So you kill the deer, it's incredibly wasteful. I'm not suggesting anybody do this, but you kill the deer, you cut the back straps off of the back, and then you take them home. Well, if those bones fossilized and you came and looked at that animal, 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, you would see that every bone from that animal is still in place and still in the same place as it was when the animal died. You might see an arrowhead stuck in the middle of it, and that's it. Maybe you'd see some cut marks somewhere, I cut along the spine or something where I cut those back straps out. If I wanted the back legs, right, you would see what would be left behind in one location is most of that animal, and the bones from the legs would be back at camp. They may be bashed open for marrow. They might have been in a pot cooked for bone broth, and cut marks, all over them. Or you would see that most of that animal, the head's cut off. So there's a lot of things that we can tell looking at cut marks, bones being bashed, the assemblages of the bones themselves, where they end up in relation to camp and other sorts of things that can tell us a lot about hunting strategies and how animals are part of the diet. Unfortunately, blood residue on stone tools doesn't go back that far, but I think we still have a really clear picture of hunting in the past.
Yeah. That's, and again, no one needs an arrow to hunt a lettuce, all these, yeah, like these distance weapons. What is that? That's not going to be to go after a stationary object,
Oh, never. And and I'm not trying to be facetious about it at all, but you see it a lot of times, people posting about it, but nobody does a cave painting of harvesting a wild plant. They're always about hunts. They're always about those sorts of things. And it isn't that, it isn't that people never do that, right? If you look at the iconography surrounding maize in Mesoamerica, when maize is first, maize is a part of religion. It's a part of it's a part of economics. It's a part of everything. You see images of maize and everything prehistorically, over the past several thousand years. So it's not like you wouldn't expect to see plants on a cave wall if they were that important, 30,000 years ago. We just don't. Right.
Yeah, and that's good that you bring that up, because I remember you told a story about maize and how and this goes into the plant toxins and bioavailability as of plants as well, and how when people were using maize, they processed it in a very specific way, but then when people from Europe came onto this, there's like, oh, that looks great, and they took it back and they didn't process it the same way, and they had quite a serious problem. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely, and I love this story. It's such a great poster child. The Mongolia dairy fermentation thing, I think, is a great poster child for understanding the value of processing dairy. This story really illustrates the value of processing plants in general, but maize in this case. And I think there's some huge takeaways here. So maize was first domesticated somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. We think we've nailed it down to the Balsas Valley of Mexico. The wild ancestor to maize is just this little grass called teosinte with these little seeds. that we're not really sure why anybody even started to pay attention to this plant. I think it had to do with alcohol, but it's another story. Anyhow, through the interesting thing genetically about maize is that it doesn't take many steps to go from that wild ancestor to the kind of corn or maize that we have on our plates today. It's very easy to genetically modify through selective pressure. And it happened fairly quickly and became a major staple in diets in Mesoamerica and then the Americas in general, South and North America as well, over several thousand years. It was the staple diet of many big civilizations like the Aztecs, for example, who not only ate massive quantities of maize, but worshipped it and had entire economies built around it, religious, built around all of it. And by the time the early explorers came from Europe to the New World, maize had made it all the way from South America, from Mesoamerica down to South and also up to North. So they encountered it fairly quickly. Now, the term corn is a European term that just means grain. So even though we call maize corn today, they called any grain corn, depending on where they were. So if they were in Europe, if they were in Ireland and saw oats, they call it corn. If they were in England and saw barley, they call it corn. So when they came to the New World and saw the local grain being used, maize, they called it corn, and it just kind of stuck. And look, corn tastes great. Corn tastes great. It's filling. It's incredibly easy to grow. And we've talked about explorers coming from very similar latitudes. So they could take this corn and literally bring it back to Europe and it would grow. And they did. They took it back. And corn did there what it's doing now. It really began to dominate the diets of certain populations, especially populations that were impoverished, didn't have really good access to food, and it dominated the diets. And when it dominated the diets, it did it to the exclusion of the other foods these people were eating. So to preface this, you have to understand that when maize or corn made it back over to Europe, a lot of the people that adopted maize as a major part of their diet did so to the exclusion of other things in their food. So before the maize came, they might have been hungry. They might have even been starving. They might have even been a little malnourished, but they had whatever they could eat, they were getting, pieces of this. And it could be rats and like plants that grew outside the door of their house, but they were getting different resources, different nutrients. And when maize came in, they could grow it in such quantity. It was so incredibly cheap that they just ate corn, right? So when that happened, you start to see a disease that followed maize around Europe called pellagra. It was first at least identified in a written form in Spain in the 1700s. Then it was identified in Italy not long after, where it got its name pellagra, which means in Italian somehow, some version of it, sour skin. And then it spreads around Europe. We see it in Eastern Europe around the same time that, it's kind of crazy, but around the same time that a lot of the stories about vampires were, people writing stories about vampires. We see it in Ireland at the end of the Irish potato famine in the mid 1800s, where the US was sending massive quantities of maize as famine relief food. And what was very interesting is that people that had access to this maize were no longer getting sick and dying of starvation, but they were getting sick and dying of this weird disease they never saw before. And then the most recent major example of it is in the early 1900s in the American Southeast, in states like the Alabamas, Louisiana, Carolinas, those areas where corn still today is a massive, major part of diets. We see people getting massive in droves getting sick. And I'm sorry, I got a street sweeper outside. It's loud. We see hundreds of thousands of people dying and millions of people getting sick. I mean, it was that big of a deal. And we're talking the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, not that long ago. So our government, the US, we hired an infectious disease doctor by the name of Jeffrey Goldberger. He was famous and really well-known infectious disease doctor. And it was such an issue in the US in the early 1900s that we hired him. So you got to figure out what this is. Like, this is crazy bad. Figure out what this is. And he goes in and studies it and comes back and he says, look, you're right. This is crazy bad. It's nasty. But I'm not the right guy. I'm an infectious disease doctor, and this doesn't seem to be infectious. I think it's food related, and I think it has to do with corn. I had these accounts in Italy and these other kinds of things, same kind of symptoms. And real quick, the symptoms are things like red rashy skin initially, And then these sorts of lesions and other things that start falling off. Sometimes it was misdiagnosed as leprosy, bleeding from the mouth, aversion to sunlight, blindness, and then eventually death. And he said, this isn't infectious. And our government came back and said, whoa, listen, nothing this bad can be food related. Which, right, it has to be infectious. We already do a job, go figure it out. So he convinced that it wasn't not infectious, that it had to do with corn. So he took several mental institutions and several prisons, and he divided the populations in half. And he kept one half on the diets they had, which obviously were not great diets anyhow, but kept them eating whatever they were, and took the other half and fed them just maize. And all the people that, not all, but many of the people that he fed just maize to started presenting with the same symptoms. So he went back with this information, and he still was met with the same resistance. Like, go figure out what this is. It's got to be infectious. Now, certainly our understanding of infectious diseases in the 1930s is not like it is today, but they did know that it could be transferred, infectious diseases could be transferred by blood, through mucus, and potentially even through food. So he brought people together and held these things called filth parties. This disease, this pellagra, it really presented in very poor areas because of the reasons I mentioned earlier. And if somebody in your family got it, it was embarrassing, right? And people would call you dirty. And so anyhow, it was known as the filth disease. So he held these filth parties, gathered people around, and brought somebody up that was suffering from it. And he and his wife and his partner did three things at every one of these parties. The first thing he did was he took cotton swabs and he swabbed the person with the symptoms and then swabbed themselves with it, and all their mucous membranes. And then he drew blood from the person that was, had pellagra, and then put it into themselves. And then they took some of the parts that were falling off the skin and all this and put it in these little capsules and swallowed them. And finally, people understood, like, okay, you got it. It's not infectious. What is it? And he's like, I have no idea, but I think it has to do with maize. And then in 1936, there were a team of doctors that were studying a malnourishment disease in dogs called blue tongue. And it turns out this disease was caused by a deficiency of niacin in the diet. And somebody was able to draw the link, and they realized that this was because of a deficiency of niacin. And then we did as a country exactly what we do with everything. We put a Band-Aid on a much larger issue and said, okay, fine. Any baked goods have to be fortified with niacin. So anybody goes to the grocery store and sees fortified with niacin, this is the reason why it is. And you know what, for the most part, the disease sort of went away, at least in this country, in most parts of this country. But here's the larger issue. We have the consumption of maize, massive quantities of maize for almost 8,000 years with no archaeological evidence of pellagra or anything like it as a result of it. It doesn't show up until these European explorers took maize back to Europe. And that's when it shows up. And that's when it persists. And over several hundred years, millions of people got sick. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands died as a result of this. And even the ones that lived, the quality of life was terrible. Why? What's the issue? Well, the crazy part of the story is maize has niacin. It actually has quite a bit of niacin in it. It's just that niacin is not available to the human body. It's in a form called niacin or niacin that isn't available, and it has to be turned into something else through a process. The ancestral process of processing maize was this. You take the maize, you put it in an alkaline solution, heat it up, and let it sit overnight. That's literally it. So this was accomplished over campfires. The ash was the source of the alkalinity source, and you put ash in the water. You put the maize kernels in the water, you'd bring it to a simmer it for about a half an hour, take it off the fire, and the next day you'd rinse it, and you have a completely different food. There's a lot of changes that happen through that process. One of the many changes is that the niacin gets turned into actual niacin that our bodies can access. So that's number one. Nowadays, we use something called cal, or calcium hydroxide, which, if anybody's in the pickling world, it's the same thing as pickling lime. It does the exact same thing. And on a larger scale, when people are doing it, sometimes they use lye. But the point is, you bring it into, it's actually an alkaline ferment is what you're doing. The early explorers didn't take the processing back. They just took the plant without it took 8,000 years of relationship with a plant is an incredibly connected, understanding relationship with that plant and understand how to use it in the best way. We didn't take it with us. So here we have, first of all, I think the most ironic thing is that how many millions of people over several hundred years have suffered, how many hundreds of thousands have died from a disease of malnourishment while eating massive quantities of the food that had exactly what they needed in it. It was just passing directly through them.
Yeah.
The other more modern issue is that maize is today still the most widely grown grain in the world. And in certain areas, it is still dominates the diet. And only a small fraction of it is being processed traditionally. And real quick, if you eat a real traditional taco, a real traditional tamale, the word tamale is actually from the word nixtamalization. If you eat real grits, if you eat real hominy, then it's processed properly. But in almost all cases, it's grown, it's dried, it's ground up into like a cornmeal, and then it's baked into something or put into something. We are having these conversations. I mean, right now we have a huge attack on meat in the world because we're trying to figure out how to feed a growing population and feed the world and doing all these things. How do we do all these things to, make sure we feed the growing population? We're not doing everything we can to make the most efficient use of the food we already have. The most widely grown grain in the world, the vast majority of it has nutrients that are passing through the bodies of the people that are eating it. In most cases, the bodies of people that actually need that nourishment more than anybody. So I don't want to hear about GMO crops or new ways of farming or new ways of doing anything about maize until we're taking maize and putting it through this incredibly simple but powerful process. Now, for most people listening, nixtamalizing maize isn't gonna, knock your socks off. It's not gonna change your life. But that same story about maize can be told, a very similar story can be told for almost every food in our diets in the modern food system today. That in the past, there was some sort of a technology or suite of technologies or approaches to that food used to make that food as safe and nourishing as possible. And almost all the food processing today is at the expense of the nutrients in the food, and they're more focused on making somebody else a whole lot of money on the backs of your health. So the fact that your maize isn't nixtamalized, and the fact that a whole suite of these vegetables over here aren't fermented, and the fact that we're only, from an animal, we're only eating the meat and we're not eating the organs, the blood, or the fat, you start to put all of those, the dairy isn't fermented, you start to put all of those things together. And that is one of the reasons that we have such an issue today with our health.
Yeah. And I think that sort of knocks a big hole in the whole idea of the raw food vegan sort of thing, say well, if you're doing it right, you're just eating the plants, as they come from, the Garden of Eden, that they'll be fine. But like you say, they have these toxins and they have these nutrients that are locked up. They're not bioavailable to us. We don't have, the hardware to extract those nutrients, and obviously there's going to be, many other types. I was very surprised by the fact that they were injecting blood into themselves. I mean, that's playing with fire, it's just they got very lucky that they didn't have some serious cross reaction with blood types and things like that,
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Because that's interesting. It's also interesting, that they proved, the negative. They're saying hey, I'm going to eat this stuff and I'm going to show you it's not infectious. That's sort of the opposite, the same process, but for the opposite result, on how they showed that Helicobacter pylori caused ulcers. They were saying ulcer is just stress, it's type A personalities, it's this, that, and the other. And this guy is actually from Perth. When I first came to Perth, I was walking through the hospital, I saw this poster. It was this guy, he won the Nobel Prize for this, like in the 90s. And he was saying, he's like, no, I think I keep seeing this, Helicobacter sort of thing. I think this is coming from bacteria. And they're like, no, you're nonsense. This is well established. This is from stress. And he's just like, all right, guys. And so he took a vial of it and he just drank it himself. Bam, got a stomach full of ulcers. And they're like, all right. Yeah. Straight up. Yeah. So
That's amazing.
Yeah. It's just the balls on these guys. It's fantastic, that they actually do that. And just to show that, obviously, it's only one sort of experiment. He just did this, and people could argue well, maybe you're just stressed out or something like that. But it was reproducible. They did this a few. They could do this again and again, and so that's sort of changed how we treat these things now. It's triple therapy, 2 antibiotics, and a proton pump inhibitor to reduce the acid, and it works. we get rid of ulcers now. But that was it. It was the same thing. So you just said, yeah, you know what, screw you guys, I'm just going to do this. And which is funny. And it also sort of illustrates sort of the point that I've sort of had an aha moment about a few years ago, which was like, these diseases that we're treating are really not diseases, that they're actually like toxicities and malnutrition, from a lot of it. And that's a perfect example of that. And there's another example where we're treating sort of the wrong thing in Japan. I forget what they were calling it, but I think it was like in the sort of the 40s and 50s. And they had some weird disease. Everyone was getting sick. They didn't know why. And it was like 10 years they were investigating this. They couldn't figure it out. And the same thing, they had a commission, and they got this guy who's a very, very well-known professor, and they said, figure this out. And he was a microbiologist who was, like, again, an infectious disease guy. But instead of sort of looking around going, I don't know if I'm really the guy for this, he just went, right, well, let's go find a microbe. And of course, a kid with a hammer, the world's a nail. And he's just like, oh, here's a microbe. And we sort of see this in association. So they spent the next 10 years trying to cure this microbe. And then after 10 more years, so now it's like 20 years or so, they figured out that there was like heavy metal, getting out of the factories, like into the water and into the food supply and into the fish, and everyone was getting like heavy metal poisoning. It took 20 damn years to figure that out. And yeah. And so, obviously, they figured it out a bit before, we figured out the niacin thing, but it's a good illustration that we have these things that we call diseases, that we treat as diseases. And in fact, they're just something very simple in our environment that we're just doing wrong,
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, here's another issue. There's two major, I think, takeaways from this. One, or there's a whole bunch of ones. But one is the role or the value in even a simple technology that we require to take this raw material and make it safe and nourishing for our incredibly inefficient digestive tract. So that's number one. Number two, we created that problem as well, because if you went out and ate, a little bit of the Ancestral, the teosinte kernels, even if you did, along with the other stuff when it was growing, and that's not an issue. But we've taken that and we've turned it into a monocrop, and that we make it, and unfortunately, with seeds and nuts and legumes and cereals, we can dry them and store them all year round and have access to them in massive quantities every day if we want. We've created an issue that wasn't necessarily there before it. And it just seems so natural. Everybody, oh my gosh, the farming and the plants growing in these fields of wheat waving in the breeze. That's this, for some reason, people's idea of nature. And it is one of the most culturally created things you could ever put it is as culturally human created and designed as a city. A city skyscape and a field of wheat are completely engineered, non-natural things.
Yeah. I was going to say too, just to jump back a bit, we're talking about all these tools, talking about all these ways of processing food and obviously processing meat as well. I think, a major one is also, going to be fire. I read a while ago that there was something like, it was something like, 790,000 years ago, but I've seen since then, it's actually way older than that. What's our earliest evidence of fire? And do we know how we were using? Was it just cooking, or was it, scaring off, mammoth over a cliff or something like that?
That's a really good question. So there are a lot of conservative archaeologists who will just, if there's direct evidence for this time period, then that's the only time period they'd feel comfortable for saying that it was around. So we do have really, really good evidence for 500,000 years ago, 700,000 years plus. There's some direct evidence at almost 1 million years for fire. And when I say fire, I mean the ability to start a fire at will, maintain a fire and control its temperature and its light, and then be able to put it out. So the ability to control the fire. So there are some people that would suggest easily at 1 million years. There's others, and this is where I think the real value, my approach to archaeology is from somebody who's been trained in ancestral technologies. Like I spent a large part of my life learning how to make stone tools and how to make pottery and how to make fire by rubbing sticks together and, you know, all those sorts of things. And from people that are in my using my sort of approach, this hands-on practical approach to understanding all the things that are needed to form that relationship with those raw materials and that technology and to be able to do these things. A lot of times we, you know, take a step back and say it must be much earlier to get to the point of what we see in a million years. It had to take a long time to get there too. Plus, if you think of the other things that are happening at the same time, and it's sort of a circular argument, but I still think it holds water, where there's other things happening that fire must have been a part of. It's just that fire, you know, we're not talking about big fraternity party bonfires that scar the earth that you can see forever. We're talking about ephemeral little campfires that we're trying to find, you know, 2 million years later, are very difficult to find. There's a couple of really good books on the topic. Francis Burton wrote a great book about fire. Richard Wrangham wrote a great book about fire. I love Francis Burton's approach where she thinks, and I agree, the control of fire started around 2 million years ago. The ability to, like I said, start it at will, maintain it, control it, and then put it out is about 2 million years ago. But she also says, which I think is fascinating, or suggests, hypothesizes, that to get to the point where you could do that with fire at 2 million years meant that we had been forming a relationship with fire for probably several million years before it. Now, number one, the biggest issue is humans are one of the only, not the only, but one of the only species on the planet that actually comes to fire. We're not scared of it. We don't run away. You know, there's some insects that come to fire because of the light or drawn to fire things, but in most cases, animals run away. And even it's our instinct, even humans, to run away from fire. So to get to the point where we come up to it and understand that it's warm and that it provides light, took a very long time. The ability to see that, okay, that fire is continuing to burn as there's trees in front of it, but when there's no more trees, it's not burning anymore, and understand and put two and two together, say, okay, we can feed that fire by adding more fuel or adding more wood to it. And then eventually figuring out a way to start it from nothing and create a spark or create an ember and turn it into fire takes an incredibly long time. There's no other, other than a wild lightning strike or something like that in nature, there's nothing that gives the information that we need or suggestions that we need in order to figure out how to do these things. It took a very long time. She suggests that, you know, we would see a lightning strike, a fire caused by a lightning strike, eventually go to it. And I've been at control, even in controlled burns around here, where they use fire to help manage fields. When the farmers around here do a controlled burn, the first thing they do is they, you know, go through the fields and make sure all the animals that are living in there get out. And even when they do that, when they do torch the field, you see animals that were in there that they couldn't get out are getting out. And then even after that, we walk through the fields and there's dead cooked animals in there on the ground. You know, and so to see, she suggests, number one, fire attracts certain insects, and insects are a major part of the diet. So that was a plus. Going in after a fire and seeing, you know, cooked animals that they could consume was a big plus. And then the heat and the light and all that. So to answer your question more directly, we're looking at probably millions of years of forming a relationship with this technology. I think even though there's no direct evidence for fire control 2 million years ago, I'm convinced we had it for a couple of reasons, and then we just got better at using it over time. But here's one of the reasons, and I think this is a good reason. Prior to the ability to control fire, several things are important. One is we really didn't have a very good way of controlling our microclimate, right? We didn't have a really good way of keeping ourselves warm. Now we're living in, many of our ancestors were living in sort of equatorial Africa at this time, Eastern Africa. So that wasn't a very huge deal. But when we start, one thing fire does is control the temperature of microclimate. It allows us to have light. You know, prior to having fire, think about it, our days ended when the sun went down. Like we couldn't make any stone tools. We couldn't make any rope. We couldn't do hardly anything, right? To prepare for the next day. We were done. We could tell some stories and go to sleep. That's about it. So it offered light. It offered the ability to cook, detoxify foods in certain instances, and it also offered protection. So prior to fire, even though our ancestors for at least 3 million years between the time, we have been walking upright from about 5 million years ago until we control fire, been walking upright. We don't think they were living on the ground at night, that they were still sleeping in trees purely for protection. But when we have fire, it is a way that we can protect ourselves from some of the nasty animals that are on the ground. And there is some evidence that we finally come down from the trees on a full-time basis. 24 hours a day, we're actually on the ground because of this. But here's the big one, I think. It is around 2 million years ago, just a little more recently, about 1.8 million years ago, that our ancestors start to leave Africa and move north. What's happening at the same time, which sounds great. Okay, fine, they're moving north a little bit, northern latitudes. We need a little bit more heat. But at the same time, we begin the last ice age. So we have the last ice age starting at the same time that our ancestors, some of them, are moving into northern latitudes. You absolutely need fire. You have to control the microclimate. And that's one of the reasons. I think there's others, but I think that's the main reason. So yeah, fire is super important.
No, that makes perfect sense too. I mean, if we're seeing people go up as ice sheets are coming down, and they're probably not going to do that too well without some sort of heat source. Yeah. I always thought it was got a bit interesting. Obviously, every culture has like a fire myth, and it's a very profound thing when humans get it. Like I think one of the more famous ones is Prometheus, and the Greek myth of one of the Titans, Prometheus, steals fire from the gods and gives it. People ask Zeus first, we should give them fire. They're really struggling down there. Like this just sucks. And they're like, no, we can't do that, because if they had fire, then their power could rival that of the gods. And so he's just like, yeah, I'm going to do it, And so he goes and he steals fire. And he gives it to humans, and this is just a revolutionary act, And obviously, Zeus was pissed, but that it shows up in so many other cultures about how there's just this absolute just complete just epoch changing event. And then to think that came like realistically 2 million years plus, that means that these stories and that sense of like, someone's grandfather going like, you have no idea how much it sucked without fire, and then that was instilled and passed on by oral tradition for 2 million years. That just blows my mind.
You make such a good point. And so I said a couple of things that fire is good for. There's two other ones that I want to mention. One is it helps us process materials. We can create glues and do all sorts of fire hardened spears and do that. It was great. But we also tell stories around it. I mean, it is fire. Anybody who's been around a fire, if you haven't been around a fire, get around one as soon as you can. A good friend of mine, Steve Watts, who unfortunately passed a few years ago, he was he's amazing, and he's a great primitive technologist, great experimental archaeologist. He made all the stuff for the movie Castaway. He's amazing. But he said, and I agree, almost every important decision made anywhere in the world up until recent times was made around a fire. Every single one of them. Every decision made for anything was always made around a fire. And he really, including storytelling. It's mesmerizing to be around a fire. I mean, there's so many amazing things that are important about a fire. And one other quick thing I'd like to mention, one of the images I had in my head when I started to learn how to make fire, I wanted to learn how to make hand drills and bow drills and all those things. And it was incredibly rewarding to learn how to do that. But I had this image in my head, of every time I needed a fire, or somebody in the past needed a fire, they'd get out their sticks and they'd do their thing and they'd make their fire. It's not very accurate. That's what we do today, right? That's what we do today. We light a match or we get a burner or whatever. I have a really good friend. His name is Seamus Caulfield. He's an awesome archaeologist in Ireland, and he grew up in this little tiny coastal village in the northwest of Ireland, in County Mayo, called Belderrig. And he grew up without electricity. He grew up without running water. And he said, fire was a part of my life every day. That's where we got our heat. That's where we got our light. And that's how we cooked our food. It was one of the most important parts of my life. I was around it every day of my life. And he said it wasn't until he was in his 30s that he saw a fire lit for the first time. And I said, wait a minute, how can that be? He said, it never went out. Yeah. It is easier to keep a fire going than it is to start a fire from scratch. And they just, at night, we're talking about peat fires made from sod. They would bank the fire at night. In the morning, they'd move it, expose the coals, throw some more peat on there, get it sticks or whatever, get it going again. He never saw a match lit. He never saw anything done, a lighter used, until he was in his 30s. They kept the fire going forever. And I think that is a much better, visual of how people were using fire in the past than it is to think they were sitting there doing hand drills every day or twice a day.
Yeah. Well, it's like even like the barbecue places, like when we were down in Texas, like I saw some of these evidence. It was just like, it's been the same fire in this barbecue place for 100 years. And like when they had like a falling out, and like they split off and made two different places. One guy like took some of the coals from that fire and went to the other one. So it was still a continuation of that original fire.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it was great. And I remember those towns because I lived in Ireland for 6 years. And I remember like just driving through, like especially on the West Coast, I drove through a lot of these things. Sometimes I would just go through, like see some little road off there, and I had GPS, so I was just like, I'm just gonna go see what's over here. And I'm glad I did, because you go into these little valleys or whatever. It was just one road snaking through the thing with like 6 houses, and it was just nothing and no one forever. And then every now and then you just stumble across like a little village. There's just like these stone houses that have been probably the same stone houses for just 1,000 years more, and then like the Aran Islands, literally they had these houses that were 1,500, some of the stone like ring forts were like 3,500 years old or something like that, and still in very, very good condition. So and people were living there, not in the ring forts, but like in the little houses. And that must have been really, really cool, I think. Well, I mean, it may have sucked for them, like compared, but like I think it'd be pretty cool. And so I remember those, and that's really interesting, to see that, and to know about the fire, like just never going out, because you wouldn't expect that.
No, not at all. But he did that. I love. Obviously I grew up watching Westerns, and I grew up reading these books and listening to all this, and you get an image of the world. And when you start talking about the past, you get an image. So whoever your history teacher was had a really important job of presenting you their image of how they view the past. And some of it was great. Some of it was not even close. And it takes, once you have an image in your head, it takes a lot to sort of change that image. And the same thing, like in archaeology, the image of plants being so important in the past, it takes a lot to change that, especially in people's careers, are stake. But I love those little moments where something you see or a conversation you had completely transforms the way you look at something in the past. And even something like the relationship with our ancestors with fire, it was profound. I mean, one of the reasons we're here today, I'm convinced, is because we learned to hunt. One of the reasons we're here today the way that we are in so many ways is because we controlled fire. These are really important technologies. And just to sort of maybe put a button on something earlier, talk about technology is such a part of what I do and the way I view the importance of what our ancestors were doing with their food in the past. These, even though they're simple technologies, stone tool production, fire, fermentation in pits in the ground, and those sorts of things, you putting ash in water and cooking maize, those were transformative technologies. Those kinds of technologies are what transformed the raw materials from our environment and turned them into something our bodies could actually do something with, and resulted in supporting body and brain change over time, and eventually resulted in creating Homo sapiens. Now, I realize that many people listening are not going to go out and start throwing ash in their water and maybe fashioning their own bows and arrows and going hunting, and nor do I expect anybody to. But when we think about food processing today and how we can take lessons from the past and apply them to our modern lives, one of the things I think we need to recognize is that the power of what we can do to our food happens in our kitchens. Now, there's certainly an emotional and cultural power with cooking with our families and our kids and all that, without a doubt, and that's very, very important. But the nutritional power is something that we have outsourced to the modern food industry, and we shouldn't. We should take control of it again and do it in our own houses. And it doesn't matter. We're not talking about high dollar machines and lab coats and test tubes and centrifuges and all these things. We don't need that. We're talking about technologies that every one of us, no matter where we are, whether it's a flat in New York City or a big country house in the middle of nowhere in the west of Ireland, it doesn't matter. You guys have kitchens that are better equipped than the caves that our ancestors lived in. And you can do the very things that you need to do to your food to make it as safe and nourishing as possible. And the byproduct of it, besides just nourishing yourselves in the best way possible, is that you connect with your food in ways that you can't get from listening to a podcast or reading a book or watching a documentary or a cooking show. If you will know more about your food through cooking than you ever will through in any other way. And that has been, for any work that I did to get my PhD, or any archaeological work I did, or any of it, the biggest education I've had that has made a transformation in my own life and my health and my family's is what I learned in the kitchen.
Awesome. Well, I think I know we're sort of running close to time, but I think that's a good segue to the book Eat Like a Human. So can you tell us a bit about this, and you know what's in it, and what do humans eat?
Yeah, so that book is when I was able to finally take and merge together my archaeological work and anthropological work and work with food into something that made sense and it was meaningful for my family, that actually resulted in food on our table and an improvement in our own health. I realized that this was something that I wanted to share as widely as possible. So I started actually working on that book about 7 years ago, went through a bunch of different iterations, but what I landed on and what it is the first part of it talks about, it kind of lays the foundation, is contextual, and talks about our ancestral dietary past from really a 40,000 foot view, because it's hard to go through millions of years in just a chapter. But I think does a really nice job of taking a lot of information from different places or archaeological sources and making it make sense in sort of a timeline that allows us to understand that these are, this is a baseline. This is something that we can use to get information for how to improve my own health today. And then the rest of the book is divided into different food types. There's meat, there's dairy, there's maize, there's bread or grains, there's insects, there's those sorts of things. And every chapter starts off with a little bit of a prehistory and history of that food type in our diets. And then most importantly, goes through the different technologies that we've used in the past and still use today to transform them into their safest and most nourishing forms. And what I'm really proud of is it's got like 75 recipes in it. So there's a ton of takeaways, things you can do in your own kitchen with the most basic of equipment to make those raw materials as safe and nourishing as possible. And I've woven, what I tried to do was weave in a bunch of stories about a lot of the work that my family and I have done around the world, people we've lived with and lessons we've taken from them to help sort of provide some, sometimes comic relief, but also some really good information from a lot of the amazing people we spent time with.
Awesome. Well, I think, everyone should go check that out. And where else can people find you? I know we're just conscious of the time. I don't want to, I know you've got a meeting. So can you tell us where to find you, at your website, and how to keep track of you and support your work?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So there's a couple of ways you can find out more about what we do and sort of follow us. So my family and I, we have a foodery called the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, which is where we've actually taken that book. Just about every recipe in that book has made it into our foodery, which is partly a place where you can take away and partly you can come and sit down and eat like a restaurant. And we're making all of that food plus a bunch of others, where we have complete control over the processing of the food, the technologies I've talked about. So there's no two ingredients put together outside of the walls of the Modern Stone Age Kitchen by our team. So you can come here. We're in Chestertown, Maryland, and you can find out more about the Modern Stone Age Kitchen at modernstoneagekitchen.com. And then we also have a nonprofit called the Eastern Shore Food Lab, which is where all of our education and teaching and outreach can be found. You can find out more about that at eatlikeahuman.com. And we have a ton of education is so incredibly important to us, especially the cooking that I mentioned earlier. So we do a ton of online classes. We do a ton of pre-recorded classes. We do a ton of classes in person here in our teaching kitchen. So if you're ever in the area, we're not far from New York. We're not far from DC. We're not far from Philly or Baltimore. Please come check us out. So modernstoneagekitchen.com, eatlikeahuman.com, and you can follow us on social media at Dr. Bill Schindler, so Dr. Bill Schindler, and also at Modern Stone Age Kitchen.
Awesome. Well, we'll put all those links up in the description, and encourage people everywhere to go check out your stuff. Dr. Schindler, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and you've taken so much out of your time out of your day, and I really do appreciate it. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for coming on.
It was my pleasure. You're doing such amazing work. Anything I can do to support you, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, man. I appreciate it. All right. All right, guys. So if you've made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed that. And thank you again to Dr. Bill Schindler for coming on. That was absolutely amazing talk. I had a lot of fun speaking to him again, as always. If you like that, please go check out his book and his websites as well, because he's doing really great work. If you like that, guys, please hit the bell and subscribe here on YouTube. And you can also follow me on Instagram. It's just Anthony Chaffee MD is my main Instagram channel. And then I've also have a Patreon that I'm getting started now. It's again Anthony Chaffee MD, and I have a lot of extra content, bonus materials, early releases of videos like this, as well as a Discord community where everyone can talk to each other and help each other out, getting healthy and eating optimally. And we also do weekly Zoom meetings for like tier 2 and above. And then we'll do regular Q&A sessions as well for everybody. So, and a lot more. So if you guys want to check that out, please do. It does help, give me more time to make videos and do interviews like this. So, all right, guys, thank you very much. Really appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And remember, eat like a human.